Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020 featuring fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's guest is Najat Khan, the Chief Data Science Officer of Johnson & Johnson.
All right, good morning, everyone. This is Jennifer Bland at New York Bio. We're glad you're with us. I know everyone is rolling in right now. So I just wanted to give you a little update. Clearly, New York continues to reopen and businesses are opening, offices are opening, everyone's going back in. I know that there is a lot of flux on when people are going to be back in, and we at New York Bio are here to help you with your decisions. We do a weekly newsletter. We collect a lot of information that Governor Cuomo in particular is putting out for companies and guidance. So that can be your one-stop shop. It's all on our website if you need any extra advice. But we will continue despite offices opening. I think a lot of people are still working remotely over the summer. So we will continue to do our virtual breakfast series. While it was certainly a pivot when we started this in late March, early April, it seems to work, and we have fantastic guests like those we have today with Najat, and we're going to continue to do that throughout the summer. So we'll hope you'll continue to join us on Tuesdays at 9, even if you're now in your office with your cup of coffee instead of at home from your home office. Derek, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our guest, and we'll get our questions started. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much. And always a big shout out to our colleagues at Goodwin for joining on as sponsors of the virtual breakfast series. So good morning, Najat. It's wonderful to have you here. Najat Khan is the Chief Data Science Officer at Johnson & Johnson. It was really exciting to see that announcement a couple months ago and see you stepping into that role. And, one of the things we like to do to kick off the conversation is, a little bit about how you got to where you are, a little bit of an origin story, if you will. So can you give us a little bit of background on how you got to J&J and how you got to where you are?
Sure, happy to. But first of all, I want to thank Jennifer, Derek, and just New York Bio for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to spend some time with both of you and the broader audience this morning. So yes, Najat Khan, I'm the Chief Data Science Officer for Janssen R&D, and I'm also the Global Head of R&D Strategy for Janssen. So I play a dual role, and I'll talk a little bit about my journey in terms of how it came about. So starting very early on, I actually grew up on 3 continents before I moved to the US, before I was 17. I grew up in London, I was in the UK, and then I also grew up in Bangladesh. And, from very early on for me, just the dichotomy of growing up in the UK and then moving to Bangladesh, seeing the income inequality is one piece, but the impact it actually has on people and their lives. So many diseases that are unnecessary, avoidable, that we can treat in certain countries that we cannot, really impacted me from early on. My parents are also both physicians, so dinner table was always about, my dad's a surgeon, my mom's a radiologist, so this is something that started very early on. So my core mission has always been, how do we use science to improve the life of patients everywhere? And having that level of equity in health is extremely important, especially as I've seen the. So what I started to do, in high school, I started to do a lot of work around public health, really understanding the health system. So it was very clear to me when I moved to the US when I was 17, that I would actually do my undergrad in chemistry and computational sciences. So because I could see the shift that was coming through in terms of how do you use computational models, methodology to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of how we do so many different things. So loved math, loved science, made sense to do that. Fast forward, I went to Colgate University for my undergrad, 4 years, and I thought to myself, it's great to have those computational skills, that science skills, but how do I translate it into something that will help patients? So I ended up going to UPenn in Philadelphia, loved Philadelphia, and I did my PhD in organic chemistry with a focus on oncolytic therapeutics. So immediately I was using all of sort of my computational background to see how do I make better medicines for patients in the head and neck cancer and breast cancer space, which actually ended up being licensed to a pharma company. So that was a great way for me to say, okay, but it took some years, just to be fair, we all know this process. Now I have the computational background, the scientific medical background, but the next step to me was how to take both those areas and drive decision making. How do I understand the healthcare landscape? So I ended up joining BCG, Boston Consulting Group. It was a great experience there. I did everything from R&D, commercial, business development, payer, provider, pharma, you name it. So I had a really good breadth, and it was a global role as well. In terms of how does this entire space work? How do you do strategy? How do you implement strategy? And then after about 7 years at BCG, I said, now it's time to not be an advisor, but I'd love to be the decision maker. How do I be truly accountable to do the ultimate mission, which again has been the same my entire life. And that's what led me to JNJ. For me, for JNJ, we look across the credo is so important, which is a focus on patient. And we truly live and breathe it. It's one thing you hear when you're doing an interview, but then when you actually live and breathe it every day and the decisions that folks are making, it becomes real. And it's especially even more underlined now with the COVID-19 pandemic. So at JNJ, I have a dual role. So I head up R&D strategy, which really thinks about what are the areas we need to focus on to make better medicines for patients, prepare ourselves for the future. And looking at the entire portfolio and pipeline of what medicines are we making, oncology, immunology, neuroscience, all of these really, really terrible diseases that impact patients and have high unmet need. I also head up data science. That's the new announcement, Derek, you mentioned. Which, and it's the duality of the role that's very unique for any company in the space, because unless you integrate science and data science, the impact, I think, cannot be maximized the way we would want it to be maximized. So it's not just the computational background, understanding the science, but all of the experience around how do you bring change, how do you embed change, and how do you drive that to decision making. Those are the three components that I am using quite a bit in terms of both of my roles.
Yeah, you always have to think about how does whatever you're doing actually get to the patient. So to set the stage a little bit here, data writ large is actually a really large topic around virtually every single facet of healthcare, but really not all data is created equal, and it means different things to different people. So when you first think of the term, if you just think of data, what are the first few areas that kind of pop into your head that have relevance to J&J? Maybe not relevance, but the places that you think are kind of most useful to your mission, given the assets that J&J has as it's at its disposal.
I'll tell you my philosophy just in terms of data, right? It's all about the question we're trying to answer. And the question is, how do we make better medicines, discover and develop for patients, and then get them to patients? To do that, from a data perspective, you need as complete of a picture of a patient's journey as possible to really understand, why are some people getting sicker faster, progressing faster than others? What are the ways we can detect early when they're progressing faster versus not? How do we ensure that in our trials we're recruiting those exact patients so we can ensure that we have the most impact on the patients that would benefit from the medicine effectively? And that also goes into evidence and access, et cetera, to get the medicines to patients. So what does that mean? So that's my overarching philosophy. Now, it's a great ideal, but we all know data is patchy. So, when I think about the data types that are really important, it's everything from, and Derek, you mentioned a little bit about this before we connected today. It's everything from genomic data, proteomic data, trying to use more and more RNA sequencing data, so you can really de-average what's happening at a singular cellular level. We're also, of course, looking at claims data, physician notes. That's a tricky one, right? So much rich information in physician notes. But being a daughter of parents, I can tell you, physician notes are messy. And so there's so much richness there, right? In terms of how is the patient actually doing, these subtle phenotypic, observations that you have, you can't get in a claims data. But to do that, we have to unlock the right data science, and whether it's NLP, not just NLP, it's even beyond that, to say, are we curating, are we extracting the information the right way? So that's one type of data set. lab results, images. That's becoming even more and more interesting, I'd say, Derek, in recent years, because how you can actually leverage images and apply data science to it has evolved significantly. And our industry can't take credit for it, right? It's actually other industries, and we're using the learning leapfrog. And there's two ways you can do it. One, there's some features, in an X-ray a physician would look at. So that's great, you can automate that. But the more interesting question is, what are those features that we had never noticed before that might be correlated with outcomes of patients? We're doing a ton of work on that. It's a huge area of focus that my team is working on in oncology, disease progression, prostate cancer, different types of cancer. Also in immunology, talk about IBD, GI, right? We do colonoscopies. Well, can we do a better job of really understanding where somebody is in their disease progression time, who's going to progress faster versus not? So I just want to say images is another one, radiographics. So there's a lot of types of images. And Derek, one of the things we're doing is it's not helpful to just have data sets. More data isn't a good thing. Rich data that's linked is a good thing. So to the point I was making earlier, how can I get as complete of a picture of patients as possible? So we have a really talented one leader on my team, Xiaowing Wu. She's an MD and she's a technologist. Having that bilingual sort of what I say talent is extremely important. And we're integrating our preclinical, clinical, and real world data sets. So we get that complete picture wherever possible. That really helps to answer our questions.
And we're almost in that area, we're almost slightly stepping into the unknown a little bit, because with the way that imaging modalities have advanced over the last however long, you can see things in images that nobody ever saw before. So there's a lot of things that a radiologist was never actually able to see in a scan before, but since the technique has gotten better, you're noticing things that previously might have been a little bit of a blur or a gray area that, people now actually don't really know. They either don't know what they are, or they're actually getting so much better that they're pretty sure they know what it is, but it's advanced from the way that they used to diagnose them. And now it's going to explode because you have companies like Jonathan Rothberg's new company with the handheld ultrasound. Everything's getting smaller and there's getting more and more of it, which is really, really interesting.
I would say that, Derek, and just the other thing to build on that is also one of the, key rate limiting steps. I always like to look at what's the hardest thing to solve this problem, because we all agree we should be looking at things that we don't, untrained eye or even the trained eye doesn't see. But one of the challenges is data, right? Actually having access to curated data of the images that's tied to outcomes. One or the other, it's insufficient. Yeah. And, I just want to call out that, there's startup companies, this is where the external landscape is very important. We have our internal data, but like you were saying, the external landscape, new devices being built and the data being generated. Also other companies that are just focusing on imaging data itself, digitizing it, making sure it's tied to outcomes. And then I don't want to forget, I live in New York City, so I can tell you in New York City, there's so many great academic medical centers. It's very, very unique. Talk about Columbia, Mount Sinai, so many, and even images there. So we're starting to partner also with academic medical centers to say, hey, let's do this together, because early diagnosis, being able to predict not just even radiographic images and histopath. What about ECGs? What about EKGs? Things that we do frequently on patients, right? That's another thing we can apply data science at. And we have conditions like pulmonary arterial hypertension, where it's of huge importance to be able to diagnose patients earlier. So I'm just, this even a broader group, and then leveraging that external ecosystem becomes really important. We can't do it alone.
Yeah, that was actually where I was going to ask a question, as far as it's great to identify, right, and know sort of what type of data is helpful, but then how do you go about getting that if it's not something that Janssen has direct access to through your primary investigators, right, or your own clinical trials? How do you decide where to go? And what about patient foundations? Do you all reach out to them at all?
That's a great question, Jennifer. If I can just, again, I start with the overarching, how do I think about it? My own philosophy is look at the pipeline. And we do this very rigorously. We look at the pipeline and we say, what are the questions that are most important? So one axis is important. The other axis is feasibility using data science.
Yep.
It's really important to do both, because a lot of the times the former is actually clear, but the latter is difficult. That's where, Jennifer, your question is critical. what is feasibility? For me, feasibility is understanding, do we have the data for it? I mean, look, majority of the time, we're not going to have it in the four walls of J&J. I mean, we might,
Yeah.
but that's incomplete. You know, one of the things I really like about J&J is we blur the line between internal and external. The best anywhere, as long as it serves the purpose of answering that question.
Yeah.
So what we end up doing is, you know, there's landscaping efforts that's done, but Jennifer, knowing the ecosystem, right? Knowing the startup companies, and there's new ones every day, knowing that medical centers, the foundations, registry, and not just US. Let's talk about even US, because it's a very different space altogether. You know, payer systems, so the data sets are actually quite different than it is in the US. So we do a rigorous assessment there, not just what's the ecosystem, but then doing diligence on data. Do you have the data? And if you think about a lot of these questions, you whittle down what you need, the number gets quite small.
Yeah.
So be expansive as possible at the top of the funnel, as I call it, being very minded is extremely important. And so we have, you know, folks in San Francisco, in, you know, New York, London, et cetera, that are really embedded in those ecosystems. It's important to do that. And then we use that data, what data we could get access to, combined with what's the right algorithm. I'm going to say something that's probably not very popular, which is you don't always need machine learning and the most sophisticated algorithm to answer a question. It has to be.
Sorry, everybody, that's it for the webinar today. We're all done.
And
You're out. You're done.
But you have to be, you know, you have to use things that are fit for purpose, right? What will actually answer that question? And using 2-3 different types of algorithms, testing, validating it prospectively, the validation is really important. So that's what we do to really understand the feasibility. And let's not forget about the regulatory considerations too, US, US. So it's a pretty hefty exercise that we work through before we even embark. And so by then there's a good plan in place of who we work with and how. Does that answer the data, but then broadly as well?
It does. And I actually, so I'd like to talk a little bit more about partnerships, but actually before we do that, you brought up something that I think is really interesting, and I don't think people have a great perspective on. So we talk a lot about data in the US, and I think people have a general idea of what it means in terms of how we interact with our own patient data and what it means to go into a hospital. But could you talk a little bit about how it's different in different parts of the world, right? I don't think most people in the US don't have a great understanding of the NHS, and I can't imagine that we have a really good understanding of what kind of data exists in other countries. So maybe if you could give us an idea of, you know, who's really good at this? Are there places that you know, do you think the landscape is pretty flat across the globe? Are people kind of getting better at the same rates, or are there pockets of places that are far and away advanced and really, really good if you're looking for kind of well-curated data sets with things tied to outcomes like you had mentioned before?
Yeah, so, you know, the point you just raised around well-curated, tied to outcomes and regulatory grade, that's, you know, there's a bar for that. So let me just start with, let's even start with Asia, right? So if you look at China, if you look at South Korea, for instance, Japan and Singapore, for instance, different maturity curves, right? And as expected in terms of data collection, that's the first step. And then of course, this curation, making it regulatory grade, et cetera, et cetera. So you go up that maturity curve. I think in China, we're starting to see a lot more than even a few years ago, it's moving fast, of data that's starting to be collected. Especially in, I would say, you know, the tier 1 hospitals where they're starting to have more EHRs and those systems pulling. So that's great to see. We're very closely, you know, engaged in the types of data sets, because even like there's certain conditions and diseases that are very unique to the patient population in China. So it's great learning for us there, even just understanding the patient journey. I would expect that that's going to evolve at a quite fast rate over the coming years. But then there's the step, Derek, right? Like how do you clean it? How do you curate it, et cetera? And at the same time, you see the regulatory implications and the policies and guidance are also evolving. It goes hand in hand in terms of data collection to curated and regulatory grade data. I would say Japan, much more mature already in that space. Singapore, for instance, in Singapore, there's a great, you know, national one sort of integrated database, which is great. It's a great place to actually do analyses, and just we've partnered with NUS, the National University of Singapore, quite a bit on that as well. moving into, and then there's also the privacy piece around that. That's also
Mm-hmm.
evolving overall. Very different than it is in the US. I would say it's still in progress. Then if
Do
you
they
go,
have the same interoperability issues that we have as well?
yes, I mean, I think
Okay.
absolutely a lot of places do. Again, places that are, tend to be, and I'm talking broad strokes,
Mhm.
a single government system, here's the
Yeah.
that happens to be less just because it's centralized and consolidated, right?
Right. That's
Yeah.
why I asked.
China definitely see that happening so far, and it's probably going to happen more. But there's a lot of learnings through what we've gone through, right? That
Mhm.
hopefully incorporated there as well. And then in Europe, I would say, for instance, there are the Nordic countries, for instance, Sweden. Again, integrated one system end to end. Sweden has a great, longitudinal
Mhm.
database, and NHS in the UK. I mean, grew up in the UK. I can tell you, and they've done a lot in terms of NHS digital, being able to do a lot of analytics, which you also see play out with the COVID-19 epidemic.
Right.
And then you have other areas like Germany, Italy. Again, much more centralized. But then the only difference I would say is in terms of data privacy, they're very different rules in terms of data sharing, the data being extracted from the country. How do you process that data? So there's specific rules and regulations there that we, of course, work through as well. But in terms of the maturity, everybody identifies the need for data. It's what question do you answer with it? Right? And then that's the more important thing. Are you answering the right question, and are you doing it well?
Right. So, I mean, your goal, your position now sits over all of JNJ, and JNJ is everything from literally consumer health to medical devices to therapeutics. Although you're within Janssen, right? So I imagine you're largely therapeutics focused. But even within the multiple therapeutics areas, how do you think most about where your efforts are best applied? So could you talk a little bit about what I'll call ROI, which is a little bit of a challenging thought in terms of data science. You can think about it in terms of patient outcomes. I'm sure there has to be kind of a pipeline metric for what you're doing. What's your window on how you think about that? Do you think about a lot of things that are either early wins? Do you have things that are transformative that you look out over a decade? You've talked a lot about feasibility, so that kind of that dovetails in here too.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Something I think actively about. So I made a conscious decision. So just, when we look at R&D, let's just start with R&D as an example. There are opportunities in discovery and opportunities in development. The timelines for both of those are quite different. My philosophy is you have to have a balanced approach of looking at both quick wins, mid and long term. However, let me just talk about a few examples, and that's what we've done. But we're focusing a lot on development, because that is an area where you see, back to your question on ROI, that you can actually see return on investment sooner. And Derek, before I get into even example, why is that important? Of course, it's important because you want to get some quick wins under your belt. But one of the most important reasons is for change management. There's nothing like wins that actually help with change. Like, let's be honest, like, one of the hardest parts of my job, and I think that's a question we're going to get to, but one of the hardest parts of this role is anytime you're bringing in a new capability, there's a restoring force, right? The restoring force is there have been things that have been done a certain way, even organizations set up in a certain way, processes for so long that will push back against that. So as long as there's good ROI and value delivery, then it's worth to do it. Change for the sake of change is not what anyone should be doing. So that's why I think we've focused a lot of development, Derek, in the near term to drive value. So some examples, right? Some examples of where you can have ROI that's really clear, where you're getting cost efficiencies, or you're doing things faster, cheaper. So an example, clinical trial operations, right? We all know that finding patients is hard. And not a lot of patients, 4% that actually want to be in a trial get recruited. And this is not just a concept. We've actually built algorithms using public data or internal data that really help us select which sites we predict will enroll when. And we've actually gone back and said, what we predicted, how accurate was it?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's very high, because if you don't do that, that's proof of the pudding, right? Like, there's no
right.
And it's extremely high accuracy, right, in terms of the ones we predicted, and it shortened timelines for us, the recruitment timeline, by months. And months actually means a lot here. Faster, and better. And on top of that, let's talk about diversity for a second. We talk about diversity in trials, right? But how do you actually action it? So there are indications and diseases we're looking into, like say lupus, where you want to be reflective of what the true diversity is in the, not just what you can find in a recruitment trial. So again, those same algorithms helped us, target areas and sites where we can actually get the representative diversity that we would need.
Yeah.
So we went back and we checked what we predicted and what we ended up enrolling. So to me, those are like tests to make sure what we're doing is working well. And now we're scaling that across our entire portfolio. There it gets very clear. 3 months earlier, this much less in cost, you know what your ROI is because you know what you're generating. Another example, which is less about just cost efficiency, but improving the probability of success of a program.
Yeah.
In R&D, even a few percentage makes a huge, huge difference for us, right? Especially the earlier you do the inflection point there, it's huge.
Yeah.
So, in terms of how do we say, target the right patients? So looking at patient journey, looking are they clustering in a certain way based on certain predictive factors is something that we're working towards. We have different vaccines. We look at how do you target patients or subjects that would benefit most from that vaccine. Know which patients are likely to get that disease, earlier. So this is where the physician notes, you name it, the claims and all of it, help target that. Because if we design our trials better, all of the downstream impact, talk about evidence, recruitment, everything, you lift up all boats essentially. Do that. And I would say the other things, like we talked about external control arms. That's another example. We actually have Balversa, which was approved about a year ago, where we constructed an external control arm using data to show that it would be more effective versus the standard of care. And that was accepted by the FDA in the NDA. Like, do you know what I mean? There's a clear ROI. You don't actually run another control arm, comparator arm, and you actually get to market faster. The last example I'll say, things that are transformative in discovery. I'm a chemist, that's my background. So I always think about how do you actually figure out the right molecule to make, because that will become medicine at the end of the day. So we use this approach called cell painting. So essentially, instead of in normal, in science, what you do is you build an assay specifically for a molecule that works. Here, you can take a cell and you can actually look at the entire cell to see what are the perturbations or changes you're seeing based on the different compounds you're testing. It's quicker, it's simpler, higher density of information because it's images, back to Derek's point. There are things we didn't expect, there are things we never expected because we never saw it before, can completely fundamentally change how we test and test which molecules we are going to work on. And you do it in a much faster, effective way, completely different from anything that's done before. But that will take a little bit longer, Derek, right? There's also an ROI, so you balance both.
So I think this question is relevant at this point. And I was just actually in the middle of writing back to the person that asked it. So Martin Ackerman from Envisagenics, which is a company in J Labs in New York, has a really interesting thought about a third pillar in between data and algorithms, which is domain expertise. Yeah. So you had mentioned some of this before, but can you talk a little bit about the role of domain expertise in how you get value out of data? Because really you had set this up before with data curation. Is it cleaned? Is it tied to outcomes? What is the data you're actually using rather than are you just throwing this data through a machine learning fire hose?
Exactly. I would say domain expertise is critical to the question you're asking and also how you're interpreting the data. Data interpretability is critical, and that drives how you're using it for decision making. So at Janssen, from a data science perspective, our entire team of data scientists are bilingual. So they all have background oncology and data science, neuro and data science. Like I mentioned, head of platforms, MD, she's a physician who is practicing and also a technologist. And they can be trilingual and many others, but that is critical, right? And we partner very, very closely with our clinicians. So let me explain one thing that organizationally, I think I was alluding to before, that's quite different. The duality of the role that you combine strategy also with data science is extremely important, because sometimes you'll hear data science groups that are centralized say, I'm answering these questions for the business. Well, we are both the business and data science. There's a fundamental difference there, right? Because the questions are not being sent to you. The questions are something that we're driving that we think we should answer. And a lot of the organizational groups that we have data scientists embedded in oncology, in immunology, in neuroscience, who are partnering with data scientists that are, I would say, more generalists, right? Thinking about machine learning, AI, and how we apply it. Is that partnership done well? Is how we make sure that we are answering the right questions, but then also interpreting the data analysis, the data integration in the right way. So absolutely critical. And I would even go further. It's not just domain expertise in science, but domain expertise in specific areas we're focusing on as well.
So two things. So number one, you've mentioned this a couple times, and I really like the way that you've framed this phrasing. You think about the questions that you're asking, and anybody who's had any experience with design and innovation knows that you spend most of your time thinking about the question that you're trying to ask, right? So I think it would be really interesting to talk about that just for a little bit, and maybe give an example of how you think about things from either pick a therapeutic area, pick one of the places that you're thinking about, and how that kind of like design thinking and framing the question really impacts the way that you look at things. And I'll follow that with we got a good question from David Shaywitz, who's joining us from the West Coast, early morning, talking about incorporating kind of tech and data scientists into a discovery thing, or into really a pharma R&D organization. So there's a lot of different viewpoints in there, and how do you take that and really kind of start to look at problems and look at questions differently?
So I'll take the first question first, Derek. So the first question around is how do we think about the right questions to answer?
Yeah.
And some examples. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And as you mentioned, I spend a lot of time on that space, because if you don't pick it right, then we are not spending our time the right way. So I'll give a couple of examples. I'll give one in oncology and I'll give one in immunology. In oncology, for instance, we have a lot of different indications we're looking at, a lot of disease areas, but we want to go in earlier and earlier, right? Interception of disease earlier and earlier. It's something actually I worked on in my PhD thesis as well. So it ties to what I've done before, and we are continuing to do now. In oncology, if you look at the landscape, we've done external control arms. We want to do more and more of them, because a lot of the indications we're looking at is a certain genetic mutation that we're driving towards. It's a very precision medicine at its best. So you want to make sure that you really understand what this population looks like outside, the patient journey, etc. And the endpoints as to how you figure out if the medicine's working is a bit different in oncology. It's a hard endpoint. Overall survival, right? It's different. Yeah. It's much easier to extract. So the kinds of questions we're looking for there is, can we use imaging? Can we use, external control arms, all of these examples to go earlier in the disease and to show and to intercept it early. So it's a different type of question. And then it ties to all we talked about, histopath, radiomics. How do we use all this data? What can we not, and apply that? Immunology, very different space.
Yep.
If you look at endpoints, they're soft endpoints. It's one of the biggest challenges, right? What we have in trials is composite endpoints. It's a bunch of systems together and you give a score. How does that work in the real world? A physician is not using that. How do I know?
Yeah.
Here, try this for 6 months. Tell me how you feel.
Exactly. How do I, and being a patient in this space myself, I mean, I have real life experience in terms of how can we get even more precise? It's a very different problem you're solving for. So there, I'll give you an example. We just licensed an asset for atopic dermatitis. My first question is, I want to have a data-driven way for every single indication we're in to understand what's the patient journey. Simple question, right? I know, KOL input is critical for us, but how do we build on that? How do we look geographically at their differences? US. So that's where I would first start. And as we look at the patient journey, my next question is, what are the markers of disease progression? Is there a better endpoint I can develop using real world data versus what we already It can be secondary, it can be, that's okay, but is there something else we can add that's actually going to be more relevant in the clinical setting? Now, this is not an easy problem to solve, right? Real world data is messy, it's incomplete. I mean, I can tell you all of the negatives.
Subjective.
Yeah.
Exactly. But my belief is unless we try and do, and we actually, that's why physician notes becomes important, and the methodology,
Right.
data, and there again, Derek, you need domain expertise. So the data scientists working on that are also those that have background in GI or RU, not just
Right.
the data scientist who's looking at it, in a generalist way. But that becomes very important because, to me, if we can unlock endpoints from real world data, we're going to unlock a lot of conditions where there are no hard endpoints. It's very, very hard problem, not just in immunology, but neuroscience and others. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, this is an important question for IBD, for lupus, for all of these different conditions, something we should go down the path of, right?
Mhm.
And then you do the feasibility that I was mentioning, Jennifer, like, is there data? Are we going to get this in physician notes? And I really understand which ones you start with first. But that's the level of deliberation and intentional takes to say, why is this question important? Can you actually do something with using data science? And it varies for different areas. Oncology, even from a data set perspective, much more mature from an external world versus even immunology and other areas that are picking up.
Right. We had a good question lobbed in from the audience, and it's about the role, how the role of data science. Obviously, I mean, your being with us today indicates, right, the increasing importance of data science in development, and talking about recruiting and looking at recruiting data scientists in the future and how we, as the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, will compete with the likes of Google and Amazon, right? There's a lot of data out there. So how do we ensure we've got a diverse and full pipeline of individuals that want to work with us?
It's a great question, Jennifer. Something I think about more than I'd like to admit to. We've had many conversations internally about this, and I'll tell you again my philosophy on this. I don't look to actually compete with the Apple and the Google and the Facebook because fundamentally, we are in a different space in a different company, and our mission is very different. As an industry, I'm not just talking about JNJ.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The mission is to actually make medicines to help people at their lowest points. I hate to say it, right? Which is even more pronounced with COVID-19. My team is doing a lot of work in this space.
Yeah.
And I just see the enthusiasm going above and beyond, not leaving anything behind in terms of what we can do to better understand who we should vaccinate, where we should vaccinate. That type of energy, that type of motivation is hard to direct. It's something that comes from within it because of the mission that this industry broadly focuses on. So that's what I emphasize the most in terms of we are a medicines company. Data science is fundamentally going to change how we make medicines. That is the core goal. And I have been fortunate enough to have a lot of folks on the team and folks I've met, through not just recruiting, just getting to know people that truly believe in that. And they're coming from many different industries. I think that is our biggest differentiator, I would say. And that's, again, motivation for what I do and what a lot of us do. So that's what I emphasize on. And then the second piece is, how about talent that hasn't been in the data science, in the healthcare space? How do they transition? I always look at talent from a performance, but then potential. So if there is potential, we have a lot of folks that have joined our team that 3 months ago never worked in the healthcare space. But having that community of data scientists who are teaching and learning and just working together, the clinicians, the chemists, the other scientists, it makes a huge difference as to how much you learn. So if you have the propensity to learn, I've definitely seen that transition not be at all. And the last thing I'll say is around diversity. So I think about diversity in a couple of different ways. One is the diversity of experience, diversity of thought. It's really important to do data science. I want that complementarity in a team, really critical. And we have that, which I'm really excited about. The other is, of course, diversity of, all types, right? Whether it's gender, whether it's race. I mean, I wasn't born in this country. I'm definitely not, what we think about in terms of non-diverse. But the reason it's important to me is, in our team, in my team, we have about 40 to 50% female data scientists. That's unheard of in this industry. And what I always urge is, when you recruit, don't just ask for, the first slate. push everybody, dig deeper to really understand the mission and understand different perspectives and also backgrounds. And if you do that, it's a testament to you can do it. Because I've heard so many people say that will never happen. It's just not possible. And it's just not, the pool isn't there. Excuses galore, right? So that's what I would say when I think about recruiting. Let's be differentiated on what actually makes us different and use that as a strength, because that is the core mission as to why we do what we do. And then let's really work hard to recruit in ways that we haven't recruited before, because there's a lot of talented people out there, whether they've done healthcare or not, and that's okay. And then let's think about how we retain. That's something we don't think about enough. Right? We recruit and then we say, oh, here we go, here's the number, we're done. No, think about retention. How do you turn data scientists into folks that are shaping decision making? I actually have all of my team members do that. They present their own work, but I always tell them, how is this going to change the question you're trying to answer? And then how are you going to embed it at scale? We can't do that. This is only going to be an interesting, slide or analysis. Doesn't get embedded. That leads to development. So just again, it's around complementarity, but also recruitment done the right way and retention.
One possible silver lining, if you will, from coronavirus and the discussion, clearly we're having a worldwide discussion around data, right? Every day we check the Johns Hopkins website. We have everyone has their favorite data sources, right? And I think that it may actually inspire this sort of younger generation, high school, college children who are interested, and all of a sudden they're like, wow, this makes a difference. We track things. Even my 14-year-old took an epidemiology course from UNC online, just because he wanted to be able to understand sort of, what people were talking about. And so do you think that has the potential, and this is a years out, obviously, but to inspire others to think about data differently and we talk about it more publicly?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a couple of things there. I think absolutely. I mean, that's how years ago I got interested. For me, growing up in Bangladesh, infectious diseases and the progression, that a lot actually. I did a lot of work also using data science. Back then it wasn't called data science, but how do you really improve the production of rice in Bangladesh? If there, it's a huge problem. That's what I did when I was 15. That's how I started getting interested in, hey, I can answer this question much better. There's so many variables if I actually use more sophisticated analytics. So the reason I say that is absolutely, I think that's going to happen and we need to encourage it. And there's so many more resources now, right? You can take, like your son did,
online.
Very resourceful, I must say. So that's a great sign. But more and more you actually see also in universities, right? There's more and more, not just data science as a discipline, but data science and science as a discipline. The duality is more and more, it's more intentional now. So we've definitely seen, an uptick in sort of the talent and the range of expertise and capabilities coming through. But there's another aspect to it as well. When I think about COVID-19, just taking a step back, JNJ has a vaccine that night and day that we've been, how do we get it out as fast as possible, make it effective, and all the it's a duty for us to the world. There are data science components. How do you ensure that we go to the right regions where there is most infection and incidence, and projecting it out, predicting it, months out? And we're using a lot of different data. There's both, the publicly available data, of course, but then also better understanding who's at a higher risk factor versus not. How do you think about sequencing these vaccines? All of that is actually being driven by data science. And, it's not enough to just do the analysis, but to be at the table to drive and shape decisions. I think that's also something we need to highlight as to how it's impacting not just a descriptive understanding of the indication, but of the pandemic, but a prescriptive perspective. How do you drive decisions for vaccine programs, which we all know is going to have a pretty big impact in terms of how to solve for this crisis. So I always say analytics are very important, but then also just understanding what's happening in the world beyond that. The qualitative and the quantitative go hand in hand when you're actually making decisions. So I absolutely agree. We've definitely seen more of that. And then also internally for us, it's catalyzing us to think differently. How do you actually initiate sites virtually? How do you get medicine patients out remotely? All of these things we talk about, we do little pilots, but now you see the scale impact. And we're already seeing sticky factors, for instance, telehealth, right? If you look at China, even in China, there's a huge uptick, even after in Wuhan and other regions, conditions got better. So I think there is like you said, it is a silver lining of sorts, but it's like, how do we catalyze the use of data science and broadly even digital to do what we do much more, whether it's, for the programs, operations, etc. And we're already starting to see that as well. And I think that will catalyze people to see a different way of working, that will encourage the next generation to also, maybe we won't even call it like we're doing this with data science. It's just going to be the norm of how we work.
Right.
Yeah. Instead of data science, we can just start to call it science. Since it just expands the toolbox of what we use. I remember a couple of years ago at Bio, Atul Butte gave a talk about, about an entire discovery chain. And he goes, listen, I'm going to use all public data sources. He goes, you can go recreate the exact same thing we're going to do here. And, those resources are just increasing exponentially. So we have a question from Renee Veloso, which is, I think, a good one to kind of take us into the last piece of the webinar here, which is, what are some of the things that would be most impactful from either a payer standpoint or a hospital standpoint to taking the healthcare system to a better place? And you can actually weave in interception to this, right? Because fundamentally, disease interception is a very different economic and a very different outcome-based paradigm than what we have now.
Yeah, and look, economic, yes, but even just ethically is the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
If I'm a patient, I'd want everything to happen early and then for everything to be taken care of. So yes, disease interception, completely agree. So let's take a few examples there. One, I'll use a couple. One, for instance, in Janssen R&D, right? When we think about diseases, I was mentioning like PH, pulmonary arterial hypertension, or even amyloidosis. People get misdiagnosed multiple times before they actually get diagnosed with the right disease. So with PAH is women in their mid-30s that have breathing conditions and issues and challenges, but they get misdiagnosed an average of 4 to 5 years before they get diagnosed with the actual disease, right? This is it's beyond wrong and unfortunate and a problem we need to fix. How do we fix that? So we looked at, when you think about PAH, why are they getting misdiagnosed? What are the tests that they're getting? They get ECGs. Well, if you could predict using an ECG or even suspect it, because this is rare diseases, so a lot of the physicians might not know about the conditions, right?
Right.
You can prompt that there is a potential, probabilize that this person might have PAH at the primary care setting or even early on in the hospital setting. Imagine what we can do. We can diagnose these patients much earlier, and then the treatments we have broadly are going to be much more. You know that, right? So that's an example, and this is using, and data science is the perfect way to do it because you're looking at a lot of these waveform images, raw data to see what are the differences that can help you predict that this person might actually have PAH. Other things outside of even Janssen R&D, like for instance, we know that robotic surgery, it's going to be really critical for us in the future, right? So, for instance, with Auris, it was an acquisition we made a couple of years ago now, which how do you actually go very targeted and be able to detect, tumors in the lung? Or even another licensing deal we just did with Terrace, the technology where we look at bladder cancer, it's complete silent killer. Today, by the time you're diagnosed, it's too late.
It's too late.
But we're looking at, it's a combination of a device and a therapeutic, that if you can actually use it early enough, before it's even an invasive disease, right? Before you can, because we can detect lesions and other things, then you can actually detect the disease a lot earlier and actually have better outcomes for patients. Now, how does this impact hospital systems? A lot of this that we'll do, we'll actually work with different hospital systems, right? Because it's not enough to, again, to my point earlier, you can't just create an algorithm and say, hey, look at my AUC, it's great. All right, whatever. But then how do you prospectively validate that? Validation is critical here. And to do that, we have to do it in partnership. And there's a huge, economic benefit to it, of course, but then the patient life that you save or the quality of life you improve is, I would say, definitely my primary focus. So those are examples of things very different, whether it's ECG or robotic surgery or devices that you use, very different solutions we're using to intercept these indications earlier. And what we can do as an add-on to it is actually have the right therapeutics to solve for it.
Yeah.
Because just diagnosing early isn't enough if you, right?
Yeah.
That's good. We actually just got another good question that's right in line with that. And Manish Khatri says, how do you think about data, say for rare diseases where you may have pockets of data available somewhere else in the world that could help patients in the US? The patient journey isn't complete, but you have these puzzle pieces, especially in diseases where, like you said, the diagnosis is fuzzy, right? There are patients that don't get diagnosed for years and years and years, and you don't get the information. How do you think about that?
Well, for rare diseases specifically, one of the really important things to do is to just understand what types of data sets are available. And Manish is absolutely right. Sometimes there are specific registries, sometimes there are, so there's two ways to answer that question. One, again, my philosophy on this, one is you look at very niche data sets, the verticals as I call them, right? So there's specific data registries for rare diseases, and we're agnostic, we'll look globally for them, right? And really understand what's happening. Other is horizontal. So large data aggregators, right? Where you're looking at 90, 100 million patient lives or even more. What you can do then is if you understand, like if there's a diagnosis code or et cetera, you can actually then go through that to also try to find patients. Now, it's going to be a small percent, Derek. But even then, if you start with a big denominator, you'll get something.
Yeah,
right.
You use different strategies and you compare, you combine them, you link different data sets to try to create as complete of a picture as possible. And of course, we also have our internal trials and we look at that as well. That is one of the ways we look to have as complete a picture as possible. And as an example, recruitment in rare diseases, recruitment with pediatric patients is extremely challenging. So instead of doing the traditional, which is you go to KOLs that you know really, really well, how about we use real world data as expansive at top of the funnel I was mentioning as possible, and then really target, and improve your chances of finding those patients. There's a completely different orthogonal way of finding patients. Even if you don't start off with the best data set, let's try to find as many of those patients as possible and then create those data sets respectively. Of course, there's a lot of e-consent, all of that.
Yeah.
But because there's value to it, not just to us, but just to the broader community to better understand the disease, right? So that's another thing that we do as well. So it's existing data, creating data, looking at it from different lens, vertical niche data sets, and also very broad data sets and finding those patients in them as well.
How do you get, and this is sort of a broader question, but how do you get, hospitals are one question, I think, because I think that's a fairly easy thing to partner with them. You work on validating, particularly on disease interception, right? How do you work with primary care providers writ large to get them to start thinking in this way as well when they're interacting with their patients?
That's a really, really good question. Again, you hit the nail on the head, right, Jennifer? It's all about change and people and change management. That's probably the hardest piece here at all. A couple of ways. One, again, like I said before, it's always if you can answer hard questions and deliver value that are relevant for them, people start to pay attention. I mean, that's how you do behavioral change, right? And you do it for the right reasons and things that are relevant. So as an example, the ECG example that I mentioned, for primary care physicians and centers, look, their mission is the same. They want to do the right things by the patients. So if you can add a way for them to better understand, okay, these patients might have a certain condition, but also make it simple because they have so many tools and so many decisions to make. You have to think about that user experience to drive adaptability. So maybe instead of just looking at one rare disease, if there are a cluster of rare diseases, can we develop algorithms for? So it's a suite of solutions. And don't charge anything for it. And then also work with the manufacturers. How do you automatically embed it into the machines, the devices?
Yeah.
So those are those are not easy and they're not trivial. But you have to think about the user experience and think about how do you encourage that type of decision making. So there's that piece, which is just sort of the user experience sector. The other piece, Jennifer, also about how do you encourage them to think a certain way. Some of it, once you have a solution and they start to see the value, it will happen.
Right.
Sort of,
it's like a switch.
Exactly. But then there's also around, as we, engage with a lot of these centers, talking about and building awareness that takes a little bit longer, but you have to do both, I think, to actually see those changes.
Okay. We only have a couple minutes left, so I would leave you with this. So if you think about people as individual patients, if you're an individual patient over the next, say, 5-10 years, do you see the way that we as patients interact with our data and even interact with organizations like Johnson & Johnson? Do you see that shifting, right? How do you think about, me as a patient and my data from Johnson & Johnson's perspective? And do you see that landscape shifting over the next few years?
I think I definitely see that landscape changing and changing for the right reasons, right? Where patients are going to have, everybody, I'm a patient, right? Everybody is a patient at the end of the day. And we want to have not just access to our own data, because it is our data, right? And I think you definitely see some of the policies that are shifting, right? I see that definitely becoming something that's going to be more norm in the next few years. But then the question is, I think the onus is on us, and now I'm talking from a JNJ, not as a patient, is how do we respectfully, ensure that we deliver value on any data that's shared for us? That's what we need to, that's what I would, now going back to my patient hat, that's what I would want. If I'm willingly sharing data, don't use it for the wrong reasons. Use it to help me understand, will I progress faster? What's the right medication for me to take? What tests do I need? And this is not just J&J, just the broader industry, right?
Yeah.
How often do I have to see my physician? What do these numbers mean? Right? Like that is that kind of clinical decision support and having transparency on that to improve outcomes for that patient, not just for that patient, but also their caregivers, right? That's also a very critical piece as well, because a lot of the times if you don't do that, the care is limited. So that is the onus is on us as an industry to make sure that we take the privilege, if that data is shared with us, to actually add clear value. So I definitely see that trend changing. I think it's the right thing to happen. It's going to be different across different regions because of the privacy there. But again, and that again ties to answering the right questions based on unmet need and actionable science and getting access to patients, those medicines that they need.
I think you hit the nail on the head with respect, right? Because it's a two-way street, and it's a relationship with the patient at the end of it, which is just terrific. So we're just about out of time, and we want to really thank you for joining us. This has been absolutely terrific. J&J has been at the center of the response to COVID, which has been simply amazing. The industry has really all stepped up, and you and your team and all of your colleagues deserve, just an amazing round of applause. We're just really inspired by all the things that you guys have been able to do, and thankful that you get up and work the same way that you do every single day. So, Jennifer, if you want to close stuff out, thank you so much, Najat, for joining us today.
Yes.
And if I can just say one thing, Derek.
Sure.
Thank you for even doing this, right? Like, for instance, first of all, it's been a great conversation. But secondly, it even gives me and the questions from the audience more to think about, because we're all evolving and learning through this process. It's not a static thing. The other thing I'll also say that I remember joining some of the meetings years ago, the amount that you are doing and NewYorkBIO is doing in terms of just, enhancing and outlining what's happening in New York City, the kind of talent that we have. Right? I have a lot of folks on my team that are actually from New York City, and also the ecosystem that we have in New York, academic medical centers, startups, health tech companies. So just keep doing what you do. I think this is really, really critical. So I just want to thank you both for that, but then also thank you all for the opportunity and for taking the time today.
No, thank you, Najat. This was fantastic. We appreciate everyone participating. We hope, and we thank Goodwin Proctor, the law firm, for sponsoring us today. And we hope you'll join us next week. Our guest is Stacey Cunningham, who's the president of the New York Stock Exchange. So we're going to totally shift. We're talking about different types of data. We'll talk about financial data next week. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.